Hello, my name is Hamed, and I'll be presenting our work named Confine, Automated System Call Policy Generation for Container Attack Surface Reduction. This is a joint work with my colleague Tapti, Azadeen from CloudHawk.io, and my advisor, Michalis Polychronakis. Let's briefly go over operating system virtualization. Containers are based on OS virtualization, meaning that the isolation provided to the tenants is strictly enforced through software. Interest in containers has increased due to mainly their higher resource utilization and their faster startup time. They're easier to launch and they're better for software packaging. Let's have a more in-depth look into the differences from a security perspective. With OS virtualization, we have the hardware, then we have the Linux kernel, and we provide each tenant with a containerized application. But all of these tenants share the same Linux kernel. With hardware virtualization, on top of the hardware is a thin layer of hypervisor, and we launch a separate virtual machine running its own separate guest OS, and then the application runs inside of that. So the isolation provided in this scenario is strictly enforced by the Linux kernel and software, whereas here it's the combination of techniques in the hypervisor and the hardware, making it much more secure. So how is this isolation actually implemented in the kernel? So the first thing is namespaces. Namespaces wrap a global system resource in an abstraction. With C groups, we're able to limit and account for the resource usage of processes. And capabilities divide the privileges which were traditionally associated with the superuser into distinct units. On top of that, by default, Docker installs a set of system call filters using the seccomp BPF filtering mechanism implemented in the Linux kernel. So container isolation is enforced by the kernel. Exploiting a kernel vulnerability means that you can break the isolation. What's the solution? You could either use better isolation techniques like hardware support, but the drawback is that it would lead to reduced resource utilization. Another approach could be to reduce the kernel attack surface. This would limit the attacker's capabilities of breaking out of the container. In this work, we're going to focus on this aspect of the solution. So how do we want to apply kernel attack surface reduction? There is a mechanism implemented in the Linux kernel, as I mentioned, named seccomp BPF. A user space program can restrict access to some of the system calls by using this technique. So by using seccomp BPF filtering, we want to restrict access to the system calls. By restricting access to a set of system calls, we're actually reducing the accessible parts of the kernel. That means if there's a vulnerability in one part of the kernel and the system call which accesses that part of the kernel has been filtered, that vulnerability will be mitigated and it can't be accessed by an attacker. By default, Docker prohibits access to 44 system calls. We want to apply more restrictive filters. To do so, we want to identify the required system calls of each application through a sound and reliable analysis. Let's quickly bring up the topic of software debloating and specialization as a broader area which has recently gained traction. Applications typically include code that they don't use and have access to features which they don't need. Some modular plugins are not needed by a given configuration. Some library functions are not imported at all, and some system calls are never used. Let's take this simple code snippet. If you look at the code, it's only using strcpy and open from the libc library. But when we look at the process address space, the program has access to the entire libc library. With software debloating, we want to identify the parts which are required and remove the rest. So what's the existing work regarding policy generation for containers to improve the security? The previous work which has been done is mainly based on training, meaning that they use dynamic analysis to identify the system calls which are required for a container to operate correctly. The drawback is it's workload specific and it's challenging to exercise all of the code paths that may be needed. That means that a required system call could be missed. In this work, we want to focus on a static code analysis technique, which can inspect all of the execution paths of the application and all of its dependencies. This would lead to identifying the superset of the system calls required for the operation of the container. So Confine takes the Docker container image as the input and through static analysis generates a ready-to-use seccomp filter which can be used to apply a reduced kernel attack surface to the container. Now that we've gone through the introduction, let's move on and see how Confine has been designed and how it actually works. So to give a broad picture, in this image, we're looking at the flow of Confine's operation. From the start, we have a Docker image. For this work, our dataset consists of the top 150 popular and official images from Docker Hub. We launch that Docker image to get the container. By monitoring the container, we extract the list of binaries which are required for the operation of that container. This step is required because each container typically has all the binaries available in an Ubuntu distribution, which is more than 200 binaries. If we were to consider all of those binaries, the set of system calls that we could filter would be extremely limited. So we perform a monitoring step to identify the binaries which are actually required for running a container. It might come to mind that when you're running an Nginx container, for example, it would launch and run the Nginx application. That is correct, but it's not complete because each application and each container might require some initial steps to set up the configuration and set up the system for it to launch, such as creating folders, setting permissions on files, and then launching the application. That's why we need this step to identify all of those applications. After we've identified the list of binaries, we analyze them to extract the required functions, and then we combine them with a one-time generated libc to system call mapping to generate the list of required system calls. We also perform a direct syscall invocation extraction using a disassembler. Now let's see how we generate the libc to system call mapping by generating the call graph. System calls are typically invoked through the standard C library. In the 150 Docker images which we analyzed, most of them, as we would expect, use the glibc library. But there were some cases which used the muscle libc library. That's why we've analyzed both in our work. For glibc and to generate the call graph, we generated the RTL-IR and we used the Egypt tool to create the initial call graph. The Egypt tool doesn't consider function pointers, so we extended it by considering the functions which had their address taken and through over approximation considering them as the target of any indirect call site. For muscle libc, since it was compilable by LLVM, we compiled it to LLVM-IR and we used SVF to create the call graph. The output was a mapping between the exported functions of the library and the respective system calls. Now that we have the mapping, how do we further identify the required binaries and their system calls? So now we would like to have an in-depth look as to how this step actually works. So to identify the executed binaries, we use a third-party application named Sysdig, which is able to monitor all of the invoked system calls across a host machine. We run Sysdig, and then we launch our container, which has the applications inside of it. We wait for a specific amount of time, by default 60 seconds, and we filter the execve system calls. We do so to identify which binaries are being executed. And then we extract a list of executed programs. Now that we have the binaries, we have to perform two steps to identify the required system calls. For the system calls which are invoked through libc, we recursively extract all the libraries the binaries depend upon. And then we extract a list of imported functions from all of those binaries and the libraries. For system calls which are invoked directly, we use a disassembler, in this case object_on, to identify the syscall instruction. And then we perform backward slicing to identify the system call number. After we have performed both of those steps, we have the system calls which are required. Now, to generate the setcall policy, we perform the following. We have the list of binaries, we extract the functions. From the required functions, we integrated them with the libc to syscall map. From the syscall numbers, we combine them with the kernel symbols. And now that we have the system call names, we can generate a setcall profile in the format which is required by Docker. Let's move on and see how we've evaluated our approach. As I mentioned before, our dataset consists of 150 Docker images. In this slide, we have 3 CDFs. The first one is regarding the container popularity. As you can see, 20% of the top Docker images are extremely more popular. That means that our data set is inclusive of the most famous Docker images, the ones which are being used the most. The second CDF shows the number of binaries executed per container. As you can see, 80% of the containers run less than 20 binaries. Compare that number to the more than 200 binaries which are available in each Ubuntu distribution. And in the third CDF, we're showing the number of libraries which are being loaded in each container. And as you can see, 80% of the Docker images use less than 50 libraries. So moving on to the main question, how many system calls can we actually filter? Well, Confine disables 145 or more system calls for about half of the containers. In the worst case, we're able to disable 100 and more system calls, still twice as many as the default Docker seccomp policy. So what's the benefit of filtering these system calls? For our security evaluation, we wanted to identify the CVEs in the kernel, which are being mitigated as a result of filtering those system calls. To do so, we needed to create a CVE to function mapping. For this purpose, we collected the Linux kernel CVEs through web scraping. Then we mapped the CVEs to the source code file and line based on the git commit. We assigned the CVEs to the functions. Then we generated the Linux kernel call graph based on Kernel, a tool proposed in a Usenix paper from 2019 named PEX. By creating the call graph, we were able to identify which vulnerability was accessible from which system call. And if we were to filter a system call, which parts of the kernel would become inaccessible. The result was that we were able to mitigate 51 CVEs, more than the default Docker seccomp policy. 6 of these CVEs were removed from more than 140 containers, and 10 of them were removed from more than 100 containers. As a sample, we've presented 9 of these CVEs in this table. If you look at the first CVE from 2014, when we filter the set thread area system call, this CVE becomes mitigated. As you can see, this leads to the mitigation of the CVE for 146 Docker images. These are examples of the Docker images in this set. As you can see, they are famous and they are popular images used widely across different users. The CVE type for this CVE is bypassing a restriction. While it doesn't directly mean that the attacker could use this to gain privilege, it means that they could bypass a restriction, which could be a capability check, and then it could be expanded to lead to a gain of privilege attack. To conclude my talk, Confine removes more than 145 system calls in more than half of the top 150 Docker images. It's built based on static analysis for a sound and reliable result. And it mitigates 51 more Linux kernel CVEs compared to the default Docker seccomp policy. We've open sourced the framework and our tool and provided a thorough step-by-step guide. We'd be happy if you looked at it and asked us any question. I'd be happy to take any questions now, and thank you for your attention.